Hey y'all, it's me, it's KDG, and this is the Goldman Hour podcast that will candidly cover current events and other topics in emergency services. If you can survive the Goldman Hour, give or take, of honest and sometimes harsh opinions, stick around and enjoy a fleeting platinum 10 minutes of strict positivity. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and check us out for more at easyemsceu.com/podcast. There's a moment that happens in every paramedic's career. It doesn't happen during a dramatic trauma. It doesn't happen during a cardiac arrest. It definitely doesn't happen in paramedic school. It happens quietly, usually somewhere around your third, fourth, maybe fifth year on the job. You're sitting in the passenger seat of the ambulance after a call. Your partner is driving. The radio's quiet for once. You start thinking about something. You start thinking about the providers you've worked with over the years, the ones who stood out, the ones who seemed different, not louder, not more dramatic, not the ones who bragged the most in the station, but the ones who had something else, something harder to define. They walked into chaotic scenes, and things just got calmer. They explained complicated medicine in ways that suddenly made sense. They treated patients and partners with a kind of steady professionalism that never felt forced. And the strange thing was, those providers rarely talked about how good they were. Everyone else did. Tonight we're talking about those providers, the ones who quietly define the profession. Tonight's episode is called What Makes a Great Paramedic. Welcome back to the show. If this is your first time listening, I'm really glad you're here. This podcast is about the real world of EMS, not just protocols, not just procedures, but the culture and the mindset and the lessons that shape how we practice medicine on the street. In the last episode, we talked about something deeply personal, the emotional side of this job, the calls that follow us home, the moments we carry longer than we expected. Tonight, we're talking about something different, but equally important. We're talking about greatness in EMS, not perfection and not heroics, but the traits that separate average providers from truly exceptional ones. And before we go any further, let me say something important. Great paramedics aren't born. They're built. They're built through experience and through mistakes and through reflection. And they're built through a commitment to constant improvement. And the good news is this. Every single provider listening to this episode has the ability to become one. The difference between good and great. Let's start with a question. What actually makes someone a great paramedic? Is it skill? Skill matters. But we've all met providers who were technically skilled, but terrible partners. Is it experience? Experience matters. But we've also all met providers with 20 years on the job who practice medicine exactly the same way they did 15 years ago. Is it confidence? Confidence helps, but confidence without humility becomes arrogance. The truth is, greatness in EMS isn't defined by a single skill. It's a combination of traits. Mindset, emotional intelligence, leadership, clinical curiosity, and discipline. Great paramedics are students of medicine, but they're also students of themselves. They constantly examine how they think and how they react, how they communicate, because they understand something critical. This job doesn't just test your knowledge, it'll test your character. The provider everyone remembers. Think about the best paramedic you've ever worked with and take a second and picture them right now. What made that person stand out? Was it their airway skills? Maybe. But that's probably not the first thing that came to mind. Most likely it was something else. Maybe they were incredibly calm on a chaotic scene. Maybe they had a way of teaching that made you feel capable instead of stupid. Maybe they treated patients with a level of respect that changed how you approached this very job. The best providers don't just run calls. They shape the people around them. They shape the culture of the truck and the service. And sometimes they shape entire careers. Let's talk about the first major trait of great paramedics, clinical humility. Now, that phrase might sound very academic, But it's actually very simple. Clinical humility means understanding that medicine is bigger than your ego, and that no matter how long you've been doing this job, you can still learn something new. One of the most dangerous things that can happen in EMS is when providers start believing that they've seen it all, because the moment you think you've seen everything, you stop paying attention. Great paramedics never reach that point. They stay curious. They stay open minded. They ask questions. They read research. They seek feedback from physicians and even from other providers. And most importantly, they admit when they're wrong. And that last part is huge because admitting mistakes in EMS culture can be very difficult. This profession rewards confidence. But confidence can easily slide right into ego. Unfortunately, ego is where clinical growth goes to die. I remember working with a medic very early in my career. He'd been on the job for nearly 20 years, and he was one of the most respected providers in our system. Everyone trusted him. If you ask somebody if something bad happened to them, what paramedic they wanted to respond, that was the paramedic. And one night we transported a patient with what initially looked like a pretty simple respiratory complaint. During the call, something just felt completely off, and the patient deteriorated faster than either of us expected. When we got to the hospital, the physician diagnosed a condition neither of us had initially suspected, and if I'm being really honest about it, in my very early EMT time there, I don't know if I'd ever even heard of it. On the way back to the station, I kind of expected him just to brush it off, but he didn't, and instead he said something that I don't think I will ever forget. He said, "Tonight reminded me that medicine will humble you if you let it." And then he went home and he read about the condition. Not because anyone told him to or made him, but because he wanted to understand it better. He didn't want to ever find himself in the position again to not know. And that's clinical humility. All right, it's time for the first street truth of the episode. Street truth is where we say something blunt that might make people uncomfortable, but it needs to be said. And here it is. Years on the job do not equal mastery. You can repeat the same year of experience 20 times and call it a career. Or you can professionally and personally grow every single year. Great paramedics choose that growth. So, why does humility matter in medicine? Well, medicine is constantly evolving. The way we manage a cardiac arrest today looks very different than the way we did it even 10 years ago. Airway strategies have changed, stroke care has changed, trauma protocols have evolved. If you're practicing medicine exactly the same way you were 15 years ago, you're not experienced. You're outdated, my friend. Great paramedics understand that knowledge is temporary. What we know today may and likely will change tomorrow. It doesn't weaken medicine, it strengthens it. Because it means we're always learning and always improving and always adapting. And the providers who thrive in that environment are the ones who embrace change. They don't resist it. There's a question great paramedics ask themselves after difficult calls, and it's not, did I follow the protocol? It's deeper than that. The question is, what could I have done better? Sometimes the answer is nothing. Sometimes the call truly went as well as it could have. But often there's something, a communication that could have been clearer, differential diagnosis that could have been broader, a treatment decision that could have been reconsidered. Those reflections are where growth happens. Let's talk about something that exists in every EMS system, and it's honestly quite dangerous. Ego. Now, confidence is important in this job. You have to make decisions under pressure, and you have to act decisively. But ego is something different. Ego says, I already know this. I've seen it all. I don't need feedback. The problem with ego is that it shuts down curiosity. And curiosity is the engine of good medicine. Great paramedics never let ego replace curiosity. They remain students of the craft, even after decades in the field. So, if clinical humility is the foundation of greatness, then what's the next trait? What's the quality that determines how providers perform when things get chaotic? Because calm scenes are easy, but EMS rarely gives us calm scenes. And the providers who truly stand out are the ones who can manage chaos without becoming a part of it. Part two of this episode, we're going to talk about exactly that, specifically composure and decision making, and the difference between performing skills and practicing medicine. Let's talk about the next defining trait of great paramedics: composure. Anyone can perform well when a call is calm. EMS doesn't reward calm. EMS rewards providers who can function when everything becomes chaotic, because chaos is the natural environment of emergency medicine. It shows up in many, many forms: multiple patients, emotional family members, confusing medical presentations, crowded scenes, or sometimes just the sheer unpredictability of what we encounter in the field. The difference between average and exceptional providers becomes very clear in these moments. Average providers absorb that chaos. Great providers regulate it. They slow the scene down. They prioritize. They focus on what actually matters. Because the truth is, chaos doesn't just exist around us, it tries to enter our thinking. And when that happens, clinical judgment begins to degrade. So let's talk about what chaos does to the brain. There's something very interesting about the way the human brain responds to stress. When stress spikes, our brains begin to shift into survival mode. Our heart rate increases and our breathing changes, but most specifically, our attention narrows. In evolutionary terms, this response helped humans survive various threats. But in medicine, that response can actually work against us because good clinical decision making requires the ability to think broadly. And it requires evaluating possibilities. It requires considering multiple diagnoses. And stress pushes the brain toward speed and survival, while great medicine requires clarity. And great paramedics learn how to slow down their own thinking, even when everything around them is moving at twice the speed of themselves. So let's talk about that paramedic who slows down the room. You've probably worked with someone kind of like this: a paramedic who walks into a chaotic room and somehow everything just kind of starts to settle. They don't yell, they don't rush, they don't get excited. They simply start organizing the situation. They assign roles. They ask calm questions. They focus the team on the next step. And suddenly, this chaos suddenly becomes some kind of structure. That ability to regulate a scene is not accidental, it's a learned skill. And the providers who master it become the ones everyone trusts when things start to go sideways. Let's do a case breakdown. Let me walk you through a scenario. 3 vehicles involved in a crash on a rural highway. One car has rolled, one car is partially off the roadway, and there's another vehicle that's stopped in the driving lane. Are you with me? How we arrived on scene together? You arrive with your partner, and fire is still several minutes out, so you're by yourselves. There are multiple people outside their vehicles. One person screaming, another person appears to be unconscious, and bystanders are starting to approach you and your ambulance from every direction. And this tends to be the moment where chaos tries to take control. The inexperienced provider immediately starts to feel overwhelmed and overstimulated. Too many inputs, too many voices, too many possible problems. But that great paramedic does something different. They take one breath and they start structuring the scene. First priority, scene safety. Second priority, identify the most critical patient. Third priority, direct bystanders and begin basic triage. Everything else can wait. And that's composure. Great paramedics develop a habit of thinking in that priority kind of mindset. Not tasks, not procedures, but priorities. Because procedures are meaningless if they're not done at the right time. Let's think about airway management. A technically perfect intubation means absolutely nothing if it delays life-saving compressions in a cardiac arrest situation. Let's think about IV access. Starting a beautiful IV does not matter at all if hemorrhage control is the real priority. Great providers constantly ask themselves a simple question: what matters the most right now? And that question simplifies chaos. It's time for another street truth. This one is especially important for newer providers, and here it is. Speed is not the same thing as competence. Moving quickly does not automatically mean that you're performing well. In fact, many of the best providers you'll ever meet appear slower than everyone else. Not because they're hesitant, because they're deliberate. They don't rush decisions. They don't chase unnecessary procedures. They focus on what actually matters. And that deliberate approach often produces better outcomes. Let's talk about decision making versus procedures. One of the biggest shifts that happens in a paramedic's career occurs when they stop focusing on skills and start focusing on decisions. In the early stages of training, the focus is on procedures: how to start IVs and how to read ECGs, how to administer medications. Those skills are important, don't get me wrong, but medicine at its core is about judgment. It's about knowing when to intervene and when not to. For example, let's talk about airway management again. Many new paramedics become focused, sometimes even hyper focused on innovation, and it is an important skill. But great paramedics understand something critical. They understand that a well managed BVM airway can be incredibly effective, sometimes even safer than advanced airway attempts in the wrong circumstances. The difference between average and great providers often comes down to restraint. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. There's a moment in every paramedic's career when their thinking begins to evolve. Usually it happens after a difficult call, a call where everything technically went right, but the outcome still wasn't what anyone hoped for. Those calls force reflection. They push providers to think deeper about medicine. They move beyond memorizing protocols, and they start understanding physiology. Great paramedics eventually stop asking, "What does the protocol say?" And they start asking, "What does this patient actually need?" Leadership in the back of the ambulance. Let's talk about another moment where composure matters during transport, because the back of the ambulance can become one of the most stressful environments in medicine. We have limited space, there's constant movement, there's equipment everywhere, and maybe the patient condition is changing. And the provider responsible for that patient must manage everything simultaneously: airway, vital signs, medications, communication with the driver, communication with the hospital. Great paramedics learn to simplify these moments because they prioritize. They maintain clear communication, and they resist the urge to do too much at once. Sometimes the best intervention during transport is simply maintaining stability, monitoring, preparing for that next step, but not chasing unnecessary procedures. Another place where greatness becomes visible is the relationship between partners, the partner dynamic. EMS is unique because most calls are handled by just two people, which means teamwork is not optional. Great paramedics understand that their partner is not just an assistant, their partner is part of their clinical team. They communicate clearly. They even explain their thinking. They invite input. And most importantly, they treat their partner with respect, because a strong partnership dramatically improves patient care. The trust factor. Trust is one of the most valuable resources in EMS, and it's built slowly. Providers earn trust through consistency and through professionalism, through reliability. When partners trust each other, scenes run so much smoother. Decisions become much clearer, and communication improves. And that trust often becomes the difference between chaos and coordination. Great paramedics invest in that trust. Every shift, every call, every interaction. So far in this episode, We've talked about two traits that define great paramedics: clinical humility and composure under chaos. But there's another trait that might be even more influential: leadership. Not leadership through rank, not leadership through authority, but leadership through behavior. Because some of the most powerful leaders in EMS never hold supervisory titles. They simply set the standard for everyone around them. In part 3 of this episode, we're going to talk about exactly how that happens, how great paramedics build stronger teams, mentor new providers, and influence the culture of this profession. One of the most interesting things about EMS is how leadership actually works. Because most of the most influential people in this profession, they don't have stripes on their shoulders. They're not supervisors, they're not chiefs, and they're not administrators. They're simply paramedics who've earned something far more powerful than rank. They've earned trust. Every EMS system has providers like this. When they walk into the room or the station, people listen. When they show up on scene, the chaos tends to settle. When they speak, people respect their perspective and their opinions. And it's not because they're loud. It's because they've proven themselves over time. Leadership in EMS doesn't necessarily come from authority. It comes from behavior. So let's talk about what leadership actually looks like. Leadership in this profession shows up in small moments, usually moments that most people overlook. It shows up when a new EMT is struggling with a skill. And it shows up when a student rides along for the first time. And it shows up when someone makes a mistake on a call. Average providers criticize, but great providers mentor. They correct mistakes without humiliation. They explain decisions instead of hiding them. They create an environment where learning is safe. And guys, that matters because EMS is a profession built on experience. The next generation of providers learns by watching the ones who came before them, which means the culture we create today becomes the culture that they inherit tomorrow. The medic everyone wants to work with. Let's talk about a question every EMS provider understands immediately. If you could choose any partner in the system, who would it be? Not necessarily the one with the most certifications, not necessarily the one who's been on the job the longest. It's probably the one who makes the shift smoother, the one who communicates clearly, the one who treats patients with respect, the one who never throws their partner under the bus, the one who teaches instead of criticizes. That person is usually a leader, even if their title doesn't say so. Every great paramedic can usually point to someone who helped shape their career, a mentor, someone who took the time to explain things, someone who answered questions that didn't make them feel stupid while they did it, someone who believed in their potential before they fully even believed in themselves. Mentorship is one of the most powerful forces in EMS, and it doesn't require formal programs. It happens during quiet moments, during long transports, during conversations after difficult calls. Mentors just don't teach medicine. They teach mindset. They teach how to handle pressure. They teach how to treat people. And those lessons often stay with providers for the rest of their careers. Unfortunately, not every EMS system fosters mentorship. Some systems fall into something that's much more destructive: toxic culture. And you've seen it. The veteran medic who humiliates students. The provider who mocks new EMTs for even asking questions. The partner who refuses to explain their decisions. The constant complaining about patients. The constant negativity. The problem with toxic culture is that it doesn't just hurt individuals, it weakens entire systems. New providers stop asking questions. Learning slows down to a crawl. Confidence erodes, and patient care ultimately suffers. Great paramedics refuse to contribute to that culture. They set a higher standard. Each episode, we define something called the standard, a principle that great providers live by. Tonight's standard is simple. Teach the person next to you. If your partner doesn't understand something, explain it. If a student asks a question, answer it. If someone makes a mistake, help them learn from it. Because every provider that you help improve helps improve our entire system. The responsibility of experience. Experience in EMS carries responsibility, not just responsibility to patients, responsibility to the profession. Because experienced providers shape the environment newer providers will grow in. Think about the early years of your own career. The providers you worked with had a huge influence on how you practice even today. And some taught you positive habits, while others taught you exactly what not to become. Either way, those examples mattered. And now many of you listening are becoming those examples for someone else. That realization changes how you approach the job. Let me tell you about something I saw early in my career. We had a new EMT who was extremely nervous. Every call made him second guess himself. He hesitated during assessments. He struggled with confidence. One of the veteran medics in the system noticed this. But instead of criticizing him, he started doing something simple. After every call, he would ask the EMT one question: "What do you think went well?" At first, the EMT didn't know how to answer that, but slowly, he started to recognize his own strengths. The medic then asked a second question: "What would you do differently next time?" And those two questions changed everything. Within months, that EMT became dramatically more confident, not because someone lectured him, but because someone mentored him. And that's leadership. Before we continue this conversation, let's take a moment for today's sponsor. This episode is brought to you by EasyEMSCEU.com. Continuing education in EMS often becomes a box to check, but the best providers know something different. Learning never stops in this profession. Easy EMS CEU provides continuing education designed specifically for real EMS providers. Courses focused on real scenarios, real decision making, and the clinical reasoning that separates average providers from exceptional ones. If you're serious about growing in this profession, visit easyemsceu.com to learn more. Now let's get back to the conversation. Building strong teams. Great paramedics don't just perform well individually, they strengthen the teams around them. Not just their team, the teams around them. Strong EMS teams share several characteristics: clear communication, mutual respect, defined roles, and trust. When teams function well, scenes run smoother, decisions happen faster, and patient care improves. But strong teams don't happen automatically. They're built intentionally, shift by shift, call by call, conversation by conversation. The quiet power of respect. Respect might be one of the most underrated qualities in EMS. Not the kind of respect that's demanded by rank, but the kind that's earned through behavior. Great paramedics respect everyone on scene: EMTs, firefighters, nurses, physicians, patients, families, because they understand something simple. Emergency medicine works best when people collaborate, not when they compete. So far in this episode, we've talked about 3 qualities that define great paramedics: clinical humility, composure under chaos, and leadership without rank. But there's one more topic we need to address: longevity, because EMS is not an easy profession to sustain. Many providers start strong, but they burn out. And the ones who remain great over decades develop something extremely important: balance. In part 4 of this episode, we're going to talk about burnout, career mistakes, and how great paramedics protect their passion for the job. Longevity in EMS. There's one more trait that separates great paramedics from everyone else: longevity. Because it's one thing to be excellent for a few years, it's another thing entirely to remain excellent for decades. And EMS is not an easy profession. The hours are long, the stress is constant, and the calls can be emotionally heavy. Over time, those pressures accumulate and they weigh really heavy on a provider. And if providers aren't careful, they begin to change. And sometimes it's slowly, sometimes without even realizing it. They become more cynical, less patient, less curious, less compassionate. Burnout rarely arrives dramatically. Most of the time, it creeps in quietly. A little more frustration with your patients, a little less patience with your partners, a little less interest in learning new things. And before long, the job that once felt meaningful begins to feel exhausting. Great paramedics recognize this risk early, and they take steps to protect themselves from it. The first career mistake: making EMS your entire identity. One of the most common traps in this profession is identity. Early in a career, it's easy to become completely consumed by EMS. The job is exciting, the experiences are intense, and the stories are dramatic. And the sense of purpose can feel so powerful. But when EMS becomes someone's entire identity, problems begin to develop because the job is unpredictable. There will be difficult calls, and there will be frustrating shifts, and there will be moments when things don't go the way we hoped. If someone's entire sense of identity depends on the job, those moments can feel devastating. Great paramedics build lives that extend beyond the ambulance. They maintain relationships. They pursue interests outside medicine. They cultivate hobbies and passions that have nothing to do with EMS, not because they care less about the profession, but because balance makes longevity possible. The second career mistake: chasing adrenaline. Another trap many providers fall into is this adrenaline trap. Early in a career, it's easy to chase the dramatic calls, the big traumas, the cardiac arrests, the high acuity cases, because those calls are exciting. They make providers feel like they're doing important work. But the truth about EMS is this: most of the job is not dramatic. It's not like we see on TV. Most calls involve medical complaints, chronic illnesses, falls, behavioral health, social needs. If someone only feels fulfilled when the adrenaline spikes, they're going to be disappointed most of the time. Great paramedics find meaning in every call, not just the dramatic ones, because every patient deserves professionalism. Every patient deserves compassion, and every patient deserves the best care we can provide. I've been told many times my mom had the best bedside manner of any person that most medics have worked with in their career. She wasn't a superstar, rock star EMT. That's not why people remember working with her. They remember working with her because she lived the lesson that she taught me. Before every patient was your patient, that patient was someone's person, and they deserve to be treated appropriately. I carry that with me every day. The third career mistake is this: stopping learning. We talked earlier about humility, but it's worth revisiting this concept in the context of longevity. Some providers reach a point where they just stop learning. Maybe it's after 5 years, maybe 10, maybe 15. They know the protocols, and they're comfortable with the job, but they stop seeking new information. But medicine doesn't stop evolving. New research always appears, new treatments develop, and new understanding emerges. Great paramedics remain students forever. They read, they attend training, they discuss cases, and they stay curious. Because curiosity keeps the mind engaged, and engaged providers very rarely burn out. It's time for the final street truth. This one might be the most important of the entire episode, and here it is. Burnout doesn't come from caring too much. Burnout comes from caring without support, without balance, without reflection. And great paramedics recognize this. And they build lives that allow them to continue caring for patients without losing themselves in the process. Protecting empathy. There's one more challenge that develops over time in EMS: cynicism. When providers see difficult situations repeatedly, it can become tempting to emotionally detach, to stop feeling, to stop connecting. And sometimes that detachment feels protective, but over time, it can change the way providers see patients. Great paramedics work really hard to protect their empathy. They remind themselves that every patient encounter is unique, even if the complaint is familiar and even if the situation feels routine. Because for the patient, that moment is not routine. It's one of the most vulnerable moments of their lives, and the way providers treat them during that moment matters. The quiet legacy of great paramedics. Let's talk about legacy for a moment. Most paramedics will never receive awards. Most will never appear in headlines. Most will never become famous in the profession. But that doesn't mean their work isn't meaningful, because the real legacy of a great paramedic is measured differently. It's measured in the providers that they mentored, the patients they treated with dignity, the teams they strengthened, the standards they set. Long after they leave the profession, those influences remain, quietly shaping the next generation of EMS providers. So let's return to the original question. What makes a great paramedic? It's not ego. It's not years on the job. It's not dramatic stories or impressive procedures. Greatness in EMS is built from something deeper: humility, composure, leadership, curiosity, empathy, and balance. Great paramedics don't become great because of one heroic call. They become great through thousands of quiet decisions. Decisions to stay curious, decisions to mentor others, decisions to treat every patient with dignity, and decisions to keep learning. Day after day, shift after shift, and year after year. If you're listening to this episode and wondering whether you have what it takes to become a great paramedic, the answer is yes, because greatness isn't reserved for a special few. It's a path built through reflection, through effort, and through a commitment to become better than you were yesterday. Every profession has people who quietly shape it. They're not always the loudest voices in the room, and they don't chase recognition. They rarely ask for credit. But if you talk to the people around them, you'll hear the same things again and again. That person changed how I practice. Tonight's Platinum 10 Minutes is dedicated to someone like that. A paramedic who recently retired. A medic who spent years helping patients, teaching new providers, and building stronger partners in the back of an ambulance. And for me personally, someone who had a professional and profound influence on the way that I practice this job still today. When I first started as an EMT, like most new providers, I was constantly overwhelmed. Everything felt fast, the calls felt chaotic, the equipment felt complicated, and the medicine felt like a language that I was still trying to learn. I was constantly second guessing myself, wondering if I was doing things right, wondering if I really even belonged in this profession. And that's when I started working near him. From the very beginning, something stood out. He had this incredible ability to make complicated things simple, not by dumbing them down or watering them down, but by explaining them in a way that made the logic behind them suddenly clear. Instead of rattling off medical jargon, he would say things like, "Let's walk through what the body is actually doing right now." Suddenly, pharmacology made sense. Cardiology made sense. Respiratory physiology made sense. He didn't just tell me what to do, he helped me understand why I was doing it. And once you understand why, everything changes. Because medicine stops being memorization and it starts to become reasoning. That gift, the ability to take difficult concepts and make them approachable, is rare. But he had it. Later, when I entered paramedic school, that mentorship became even more important. Anyone who has gone through paramedic school knows how intense it can be. The amount of information is overwhelming, the expectations are incredibly high, and there are moments when you wonder whether you're actually capable of doing this job. During that time, he was someone I could go to with questions, and I had a lot of them. EKG interpretation, drug mechanisms, shock physiology, ventilation strategies. Concepts that initially felt like walls I couldn't climb and challenges that I would never overcome. But every time I asked something, his response was the same. He never made me feel stupid. He never brushed the question off. Instead, he'd say something like, "Okay, let's break this down." And he would, step by step. He made it easy. Until suddenly, things that felt really complicated just a few minutes earlier suddenly made perfect sense. Looking back, I realized something now. He wasn't just teaching me medicine, he was building my confidence. Because confidence in EMS doesn't come from pretending you know everything, it comes from understanding enough to keep learning. But mentorship in this job isn't just about teaching medicine, it's about showing up for people when the job gets heavy. And this job sure can get heavy. Anyone who's spent enough time in EMS has had calls that stick with them. The calls that replay in your mind on the drive home, and the calls that follow you into the next shift and the shift after that. Sometimes those calls involve trauma. Sometimes they involve children. Sometimes they're simply moments where the weight of someone else's suffering becomes impossible to ignore. On those days, it mattered having someone like him on the truck or at the station or on the other end of a phone call. Because he didn't pretend those calls didn't affect people. He acknowledged them. Sometimes it was just a simple question after a tough call. "You doing all right?" But he asked it in a way that made it clear that he actually cared about my answer or anybody else's answer. Other times it was a conversation during the drive back to the station or during a shift change later on in my career, talking through what had happened, talking through what we felt. And sometimes it was something even simpler. He had a way of just telling jokes at the right moment, just being funny. A reminder that one bad call doesn't define your entire career, but those small moments matter more than most people ever realize. Because EMS can be isolating if providers feel like they have to carry everything alone. He never made people feel like they had to do that. But looking back now, I'm a little bit afraid that he might have felt like he had to carry it alone. The reality of this profession is that over time, the calls accumulate. Years of seeing people on the worst days of their lives, years of carrying scenes that most people will never witness, years of responding when others are running away. That accumulation has a cost. And sometimes that cost shows up later. Sometimes it shows up as fatigue, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as the quiet but heavy symptoms of PTSD. He gave so much to this profession over the years, to his patients, his partners, students, to the system itself. And like many providers who dedicate their lives to emergency medicine, he carries some of those experiences with him now. That's something we as a profession are only beginning to talk about more openly. Because mental health for first responders matters. The strength required to face trauma in the field is very, very real. But the strength required to acknowledge how that trauma affects you, that's just as real, if not more real. Even though he's retired now, his influence hasn't disappeared. In fact, it's probably larger than he realizes, because every time I explain a medical concept to a new provider, I hear echoes of the way he used to explain things to me. Every time I slow down and walk someone through a difficult call, that approach traces back to what I learned from him. Every time I try to support a partner after a hard shift, I'm passing forward something that he showed me years ago. That's what mentorship does. Creates a ripple effect, like throwing a stone into a lake. One provider helps another, and that provider helps someone else, and over time, the profession becomes stronger because of it. So I want to take a moment here to say something directly. You are missed. The daily EMS world is a little darker without you in it every day. Stations feel different. Trucks feel different. And the quiet moments between calls feel different because people like you don't just fill a shift, they shape the atmospheres around them. They make the job feel more manageable. They make difficult days feel survivable. And they make younger providers, like me, who aren't so young anymore, believe that they can grow into their roles. The lessons that you shared are still being used. The conversations we had still guide the way I approach this job. And the influence you had on my career is something I will always carry with me. There are so many wonderful medics I have known and worked with and learned from over the years. I could name any one of them here, but this episode is for Mark. He was that mentor and teacher for me, and I carry what he taught me and him with me every day on every run and into every classroom. Marky, if you're out there listening to this, it doesn't seem like enough just to say thank you, but thank you. Because of you and the other great providers I've been blessed to know, I'm where I'm at today. Tonight's Platinum 10 Minutes isn't about a dramatic rescue or a headline-worthy moment. It's about something quieter. Mentorship, patience, and support. The kind of leadership that happens one conversation at a time. To the paramedic who taught me so much, thank you. You made this profession better, and you made me better. And even though the truck may be quieter without you now, your impact is still riding along with all of us. And it always will. This has been the Platinum 10 Minutes. I have one more quick message to all my listeners of the Goldman Hour. When I decided to relaunch this podcast, I was very, very unsure. But I have an incredible support system in my friends and family and my business partner that pushed me to do it. And after my first episode, I have received a tremendous outpouring of support and encouragement. So I want to sincerely thank those that have listened and reached out to me personally. Maybe I really am saying what needs to be said. I think I'm going to keep saying it. Before we go, I want you to think about something. Have you ever had a moment on a call where the monitor said one thing, but your gut said something completely different? The rhythm looks bad. The numbers don't make sense. The machine is telling you something's wrong. But your patient? They're sitting there talking to you. And for just a second, you hesitate. Because now you have a choice. Trust the equipment or trust yourself. Next episode, we're talking about one of the most important lessons in this profession. Trust your patient, not your equipment. Because that phrase sounds simple until the moment it actually happens. We're going to break down when monitors lie, how providers get misled, and the difference between reacting and thinking. Because one day, your monitor is going to be wrong. And when that happens, the only thing you'll have left is your ability to think. Until then, take care of your partners, take care of your patients, and never stop getting better. Well, folks, I'm 10-8 for now. Thanks for joining me on the Goldman Hour and for the Platinum 10 Minutes. Please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and check out all our cool extras at easyemsceu.com/podcast and become a member of G-Shift. Don't hesitate to reach out. I love hearing from my listeners, and if you send me an article or topic I use on my podcast, you'll for sure get a shout out. Until we're all 1041 together again, y'all stay safe out there.